My dear viewers, it may astonish you to learn that I don't consider myself to be an incredible dungeon master. I've done this for many years, and I have a few accomplishments under my belt. Small things like my long-running series that I did on streaming and YouTube that has some very dedicated fans, and also I had the opportunity to work with some very incredible creators in the YouTube Dungeons & Dragons space, who had nice things to say about my dungeon mastering. Now, we consider those to be my greatest accolades that I've ever received. Besides that, I've simply been doing a professional style Dungeons & Dragons game for almost as long as 5th edition has been around. I ran weekly games when I ran a game shop way back in 2014, and before that I was playing weekly Sunday games with friends. So I've been doing this for a long time, and while I don't consider myself an incredible dungeon master, I feel like I've learned a few things, being a story first, rules later, or maybe rules never, depending on who you believe in my comment section. I've learned a few things about telling a story as a dungeon master, and I would like to convey some of those things to you in a convenient, easy to follow video format. These are tips for storytelling as a dungeon or game master. Let us begin. And first and foremost, I believe the best advice I could ever give a new dungeon or game master is to ask yourself one simple question. Why do you want to be the dungeon master? Now, keep in mind, I don't believe there's any wrong answer to this question. There is one answer that I believe should cause you to rethink whether or not you should be a dungeon master, but we'll get to that in a minute. Whatever the answer to this question is, it can inform how you approach becoming a dungeon master and how you approach your storytelling going forward. If you want to be a dungeon master for fun, if you want to be a dungeon master to tell a scary story, if you want to be a dungeon master to have your friends experience the story of a cool world, or the story of a module that you particularly like, or if you want to be a dungeon master just because you know nobody else will do it. Whatever your reason, it will inform your approach to storytelling moving forward. And I don't think enough people ask themselves exactly why they want to do it. Many people somewhat feel thrust into it, or they just have a desire to tell a story without ever interrogating exactly where that desire lies. Perhaps I'm getting a bit philosophical. And this brings me to the one reason to be a dungeon master that should give you pause and perhaps cause you to reconsider. Now, I cannot stress that this is not on an every case basis, but if you find yourself with a desire to be a dungeon master because you want to tell the story of a specific character that is very important to you, you place them as an NPC in the world and you want to tell their story through the medium of Dungeons & Dragons or some other TTRPG, you should reconsider and perhaps consider writing a book, because this is not a good medium for that kind of thing. You see, when you're writing a book, you can make sure all of the other characters in the book have the reaction that you desire to the character that you've created in the book. However, if you have a character that you have, say, a lot of emotional investment in, and that you care very deeply for, and you introduce it into a game of Dungeons & Dragons, whether it's friends or strangers, there is a non-zero chance that people are going to just kind of make fun of it and take the piss out of them, and your beloved character may die in a very humiliating way. And look, I realize this is not a new criticism or a new piece of advice. Telling dungeon masters they actually just want to write a book when they get fussy about their NPCs is a criticism as old as rolling the dice in front of the screen. But it bears worth repeating here that it is something you need to consider when you're asking yourself why you want to be a dungeon master. You wouldn't invite a group of strangers or friends over to your place to do a 4-hour table read of your new original fantasy novel first draft, so it doesn't make sense to try and do it through the medium of Dungeons & Dragons. Then again, maybe you would, I don't know, there's probably more than a few theater kids in my audience. And really, this brings me nicely to my next piece of advice. Run the game for the table you have, not the table you want. Look, here we are in the 50 years anniversary of Dungeons & Dragons, and we're at a point now where almost everybody who's even interested in playing Dungeons & Dragons has seen some version of the game played. And so a lot of people end up with this kind of idealized table in their mind that they're looking for. And at the end of the day, it's better for a dungeon master to be flexible to ensure that everybody has a good time. When it comes to this kind of thing, I'm always reminded of something said by Mike Krahulik of Penny Arcade. This was way back when they used to do podcasts about creating the comics. Mike and Jerry were talking about running games of Dungeons & Dragons, and at the time, Mike had made some of his first attempts to being a dungeon master. And when he was explaining the feeling that he had and the satisfaction of being a dungeon master to Jerry, he likened it to preparing a meal for a group of friends. You kind of create this thing and then set it down in front of a group of people for them to enjoy. And I found this to be a very apt comparison, and I think about it whenever I try to tell people to run the game for the table that they have. If you have a group of players that are interested in loot and scoot, dungeon crawly, combat, fun, madcap adventure, then run that type of campaign. Adjust your campaign for what the players are interested in. You wouldn't serve a group of vegetarian friends a bunch of baby back ribs, and you wouldn't serve a bunch of barbecue lovers a ton of salad. That just doesn't seem right. It seems a little bit rude not knowing your audience, you know what I mean? And in the same way, you may find yourself in situations where what you are looking to run for a group of players doesn't quite suit their play styles. And while it's not impossible for players and dungeon masters to meet in the middle on this issue, it is not served by the dungeon master being rigid in their vision. Sometimes you have to adjust, make changes for the table you have, rather than consistently running the game for the table that you want. And look, no scenario is the same, and at the end of the day, you'll just have to do the best with what you have. But it's worth bearing in mind that sometimes you just have to make adjustments based on the people that you have at your table. And there is a common complaint amongst dungeon masters, and I see this kind of thing in the forums, and even when I ran games shops and talked to other dungeon masters, the rebuttal would always be, well, I'm running a game of Dungeons & Dragons. I'm putting a lot of work into this, and I want to have fun the way I like to play the game, so I think everyone should just have to deal with it. And I tend to butt up against this type of thinking, because I believe that being a dungeon master is an act of service. That's probably why it's something you can get paid to do now. In the same way, it'd be pretty damn rude to tell people to get the hell out of your barbecue if they couldn't eat what you were serving. It's pretty rude to tell people at a friendly table that they just kind of have to suck it up and not have fun because you're having fun, or they can just leave. In a professional setting, sure, if you're running games in a shop, people don't have to stay at your table. Again, every situation's different. I just tend to disagree with this type of thinking. Next piece of advice. Nobody can derail your campaign but you. This is a pretty difficult one to grasp, especially for new dungeon masters, but it's incredibly pertinent, especially if you intend to run homebrew campaigns. It's almost become a meme now, the idea that players derail your campaigns. But at the end of the day, you control the rails. You can make them go wherever you need to make them go. You're the dungeon master. It's your story. There's an excellent example of this from a live streamed show, and I'm going to pick on Penny Arcade again here. And it's actually during the C-Team series, I believe it's season 2. The Dungeon Master, Jerry Holkins, has created this scenario in which the season 2 villain is going to show up to menace the party before the plot gets underway. And one of the players institutes a frankly overpowered ability given to him by audience donations to completely chump the season 2 villain, and they black bag him and lock him in a van. It's incredible. It's also absolutely not what the Dungeon Master had planned for his big season 2 villain on this live stream Dungeons & Dragons show. But at no point does he fully resist or push back in any meaningful way against his players doing this. He simply adjusts course. And sure, it's a little bit of a Deus Ex cop-out when it comes to storytelling in Dungeons & Dragons, but at the end of the day, it kept the story going. There was some explanation about it being a magical clone that they actually captured, and the story proceeded as normal. And while I've never seen the full context of it, I'm fairly certain something similar happened with the infamous cupcake incident in Critical Role. The players cannot derail your campaign because at the end of the day, they're your rails. It is not the campaign that bends, only yourself. There are no rails. Does anybody remember the Matrix? Moving on. This brings me to my next tip. You're the only one who knows what's supposed to happen. As the dungeon master, only you know what is supposed to happen. The only difference between your players knowing what's supposed to happen and you knowing what's supposed to happen is how confidently you portray it. Now, obviously, this differs a little bit when it comes to full-on campaign modules, and you've got one of those smarmy bastards who read the whole thing cover to cover, and you gotta tell them over and over again, that's not the way my version of it runs. The truth of everything is that none of your players know what is supposed to happen. Only you know. So when you need to readjust, you just readjust. And if you do it correctly, no one will know the difference. You are the man behind the curtain. Embrace it. Embrace the idea that things can shift on a dime, and you can move the pieces as you command, and the story will always be moving in the direction in which you desire it. Again, your players cannot derail anything if they never really know whether or not they are on the track. Next piece of advice is if you ever find yourself running a D&D campaign and find that you're the only one that cares about something happening in the campaign, it's probably time to let it go. A close friend of mine, who comes to me occasionally for Dungeon Master advice on his games, was lamenting that a group of his players were not latching on to his lore, and that he kept trying to get them hooked onto the lore by expositing to them and having more situations where they would be immersed in it, and it just wasn't hitting home for them. Finally, I told him that the lore is no longer important in your game. Your game needs to focus on something else. And this happens sometimes when you're running games of Dungeons & Dragons. You'll be focused on a particular mechanic, or a particular storyline, or NPC, or plot hook, and your players just won't be invested in it. Sometimes it's going to be much better to let those things go, rather than spend your time desperately trying to get your players to care about them. As anyone who's ever solicited donations for charity will tell you, it's really hard to get people to care about something when they don't. Alright, let's move on to some fun storytelling hacks. Number one, you've probably heard it 1,000 times, steal everything. And not just steal things, but steal things and combine them. Grab a little bit of this and a little bit of that and put it together and see what you can make out of it. A lot of great ideas come from things like this. One of my most popular villains that I have ever used is a mixture between David Xanatos from Gargoyles and Vandal Savage from the Justice League Unlimited cartoons. It doesn't need to be complex or detailed, and sometimes you don't even need to do that much work into it. And sometimes if it's just a throwaway side NPC, just characterize them as one of your favorite characters from another show and have fun with it. You know, maybe they get the reference and maybe they don't. If they haven't seen it, it's new to them. Now, if you have trouble or you struggle with doing detailed descriptions of things when you're being a dungeon master, or something you're worried about and you're looking to try out being a dungeon master, there are some quick hacks that can kind of help you out with that kind of thing. If you've got the time, read or listen to audiobooks of fantasy novels. You can see if you can read descriptions or if you can hear them over and over again, it'll kind of help improve how you do that thing yourself. You know, if you're just exposed to it more, it can go a long way to helping you with the necessary vocabulary to describe things in an authentic fantasy manner. Another great thing to do is if you can't perfectly describe something, instead describe it as something that the people can relate to in their real lives. Like, I had my players in some deep, horrible dungeon. There was some viscous goo being left behind by some creature, and I was trying to describe it to them. In the end, I just said, you know how sometimes if you leave dishwater for too long and it becomes just like that little bit, just kind of clings to your hands and it's a little slimy? It's like that. They all instantly knew and were in the moment. If you can relate it to something your players have already experienced in their lives, it's very easy for them to do the kind of mental work to put themselves in that experience with their character. It's a fun trick. Alright, last one's a bit of a hokey one, but I sincerely believe that it's true. Number one thing you need to keep in mind is that being a dungeon master and playing D&D is supposed to be fun. Things get a little bit murky nowadays when we see all these enormous events, huge meeting halls filled with people cheering on, people playing Dungeons & Dragons, big celebrities celebrities all playing together. And that's fun. And that's really cool if you can get there. Heck, it's great if you can get there and do a fun streaming show with your friends for a few years. But they still don't give out trophies for being a dungeon master. And at the end of the day, all that matters is that you and the people at your table had a good time. And if you want to have a good time, you can come and join one of my tables on startplaying.games. Links will be down in the description. You can join all kinds of TTRPGs, and even my own TTRPGs, which I have posted in a couple empty seats for. Thank you all so much for watching. If you agree or disagree with my tips, please let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, let me know the #1 tips that you give to new dungeon masters or people struggling with storytelling. I'd love to hear it. Thank you again all so much for watching. Please like and subscribe and do all the YouTube things. And until next time, puck out.